Eagles Court, 5:30 p.m. weekdays on TV6.
Good evening. This is Ted Houston greeting you from station WRGB in Schenectady, New York.
Wonderful thing, television.
Is he really doing that?
Of course, Aunt Emily.
You mean taking a movie?
No.
Rubbish. Tess.
Tonight, instead of our usual Tuesday evening quiz show, WRGB will televise a motion picture on television itself. Television, the very same medium of communication by which my image is coming to you now.
Fade out 1. Fade in 3.
Tonight, WRGB celebrates its 60th anniversary with highlights and rare footage from the past 6 decades. The nation's first station, a WRGB history.
Brought to you by your Albany area True Value hardware stores who salute WRGB and its 60 years of broadcasting. And by Blue Shield of Northeastern New York, your local healthcare team. And by the Charles Freihofer Baking Company. Always as good as you remember.
The years like no others, where man flew places never been before, and looking at the world with a frivolous eye, without believing our spirit from those first winter games, would dare dream of the earliest conquest of space. It was the second decade of the century. With the war over and hopes high, the Roaring Twenties lived up to their name, and thus began an unmatched period in our history. A time of innovation, a time of ambition. The way we thought about ourselves was about to change. The world was to grow smaller, and faraway lands were to become neighbors. The stage was set. A new form of communication would change our lives forever. And while the world was turning, landmark experiments conducted in a small upstate New York laboratory would be in the forefront of that new technology. And this is where our story begins. Thomas Edison, the founder of General Electric, was in his 70s when the company hired an amazing electronics wizard named Ernst F.W. Alexanderson. A modest fellow of Swedish extraction, Alexanderson had found a way to magically send pictures through the air. His wife, who now lives in Florida, fondly remembers the notoriety brought to her husband and the excitement of that discovery, which led to newspaper headlines and the first public demonstration of radio with pictures on January 13th, 1928. That was WRGB's birthday. Executives from General Electric and RCA, including David Sarnoff, met at Alexanderson's Schenectady home and saw a tiny picture screen created by a large, clumsy mechanical device with a perforated rotating scaling disc. The 48-line image created was of a man and a woman. In the spring of that year, the federal government gave us our first name, W2XB, which led to a regular program schedule, 3 afternoons a week, and the first televised newscasts. On May 10th, 1928, Colin Hager sat before the cameras for the first time and read the farm and weather reports that he usually presented on WGY radio. In so doing, Hager presented the first television newscast in history. For months, those farm and weather reports continued to be telecast twice a day, 3 days a week, thus establishing the first regular schedule on television. By late summer 1928, we prepared for bigger challenges. Colin Hager, WRGB's first announcer and general manager, shares some of those moments with Ernie Tatro.
Did you have any idea at the time the television would become what it is today?
I had that feeling, yes, because Walt Baker, who was WRGB, those initials are his, and he was with me a lot, and he said, Colin, this is going to be a big, big setup, and you're going to get more and more responsibility. And for God's sake, don't start drinking the way some of these other fellows have.
This was the scene at the world's first news remote telecast. Live from the steps of the state capitol in Albany, New York, Governor Al Smith accepts the Democratic nomination for president. The first remote telecast crew journeyed from Schenectady to Albany to televise to all 4 television sets in the area. The cameras were set up in front of the Capitol building, where a special platform had been built for the occasion. Before the ceremony, there was a rehearsal, and everything went perfectly. The 4 television sets in Schenectady saw the picture quite clearly. Later, when the real ceremony was held, it rained. The entire thing had to be moved inside, where the lights flickered and the picture was decidedly poorer. The photograph that is commonly seen today is actually a photograph of the rehearsal. Al Smith would periodically leave his position at the podium, stare directly into the camera lens, and speak to those early viewers at home. Then, in September 1928, with only 4 television households in the area, each equipped with a 3-inch screen, WRGB televised the world's first romantic program, The Queen's Messenger by J. Hartley Manners, a blood and thunder play with guns, daggers, and poison. There were more technicians required for special effects than there were actors. In fact, technical limitations were so great and viewing screens so small that only the actors' individual hands or faces could be seen at one time. There were 3 cameras, 2 for the characters, and 1 for close-up shots of props. Our founder, E.F.W. Alexanderson, remembered the presentation as a little drama, a playlet that was not a great work of art by any means. Only a hand, a profile of a head, or front face could be seen at one time. The director, Mortimer Stewart, was a man brought up from New York City especially to work on the play. Everyone became very annoyed with him, and he kept calling his rehearsals at 4 a.m. Director Stewart stood between 2 television cameras that focused upon Miss Izetta Jewell, the heroine, and Maurice Randall, the hero. In front of the director was a television set on which he could see at all times the images that went out over the air. And by means of a small control box, he was able to control the output of the pictures, cutting from one to the other, or fading the image in and out. In addition to props, the 3rd camera took close-up shots of gestures displayed by 2 assistant actors whenever the occasion demanded. Those that watched the program felt that the day of radio moving pictures was still a long way off. But with all its technical weakness, The Queen's Messenger marked the first step toward future dramatic telecasts. Despite the Great Depression around the corner, development continued at WRGB. It was an exciting time of great pioneering ventures where nothing was impossible, and visionaries dreamed of color, worldwide communications, and large-screen television. Amazingly, some of these were just around the corner. May 22nd, 1930, the first public demonstration of large-screen television was shown to a theater audience in Schenectady. WRGB's 7-foot screen displayed an orchestra performance and vaudeville actors. Shortly before the Second World War, long-distance television experiments amazed the scientific community. The image of a visiting German professor was telecast by WRGB and picked up in Berlin, Germany, halfway around the world. With scores of experimental programs between 1928 and 1939, a more complete and regular schedule began November 6, 1939, generally thought to be the benchmark day for the beginning of modern television, and as a result, the christening of WRGB. By spring 1939, upstate viewers could see the King and Queen of England at the New York World's Fair. A special relay between NBC in New York and WRGB created the world's first television network. less than a year later, continuous network broadcasts would become commonplace between the two companies. WRGB cameras, also at the fair, gave thousands of visitors their first chance to perform on television. During the 30s and 40s, program formats were developed that later would be television staples. In fact, the earliest rating surveys taken by the station showed viewers had a preference for variety shows, boxing, wrestling, light operas, news, and full-length plays. One 1940 variety show included musical numbers, dancing, skits, cartoonists, a boxing match, and people playing games. Another early WRGB production was Uncle Tom's Cabin, an extravagant 8-set production. Or viewers might sample an entire evening of Gilbert and Sullivan's Pinafore. No matter what the show, in those days, most were local, and they were all live. Now we go behind the scenes to take a look at one of the programs from 1941.
Never mind the why and wherefore, luck and level ranks, and therefore, though his lordship's station's mighty, though stupendous be his brain, for her tastes are mean and flighty, and her fortunes poor and plain. Ring the merry bells and fortune friend, the ever warbling wild, for the union of my lordship with the humble captain's child. The ever joy laden ring a song the air above, for the union of a maiden with the man who won her love. The merry bells and fortune friend, the ever warbling wild, for the union of my lordship with the humble.
Dolly into a big close-up of Josephine.
Humble captain's daughter,
Or a gallant captain's daughter.
and the lord who rules the water,
And a 12,000 daughters.
Several years later, when the attack of Pearl Harbor closed down production of other television studios, WRGB continued to operate on a full schedule. Program development continued so that broadcasters would have a backlog of experience when the manufacturing of television sets and transmitters resumed after the war. Except for a short time in 1941, program production never stopped at WRGB, and for a while, we were the only operating station in the country. Over 700 local telecasts were presented between 1943 and 1944. Staffed by a small crew of technicians and producers, many of them women, WRGB telecast each week throughout the war years, with variety and dramatic programs that are possible only on a network level today. Also, in 1941, WRGB, then called W2XB, moved to our new studios on Washington Avenue in Schenectady. At the time, it was the country's largest and most modern television studio, and a far cry from the strictly experimental surroundings located at the GE main plant in Schenectady. As the business world began taking note of television's enormous future potential, WRGB demonstrated the effectiveness of commercial television to many key national advertising personnel, who would usher in commercials a few short years later. On March 4th, 1942, W2XB was renamed WRGB when the station's experimental license, issued in 1928, was replaced by a commercial license from the FCC. At its peak, the American Television Society presented the station an award in 1943 for the greatest contributions to television program development of the year. The Society wrote, "We wish to pay tribute to the courageous viewpoint of the management for carrying on against all odds at a time when the future of television depends to so great a degree upon you." By 1945, there were 9 television stations operating in the United States. 3 in New York, 1 in Philadelphia, 2 in Chicago, 2 in Los Angeles, and of course, WRGB in Schenectady. A total of 300 television sets were in use in the Albany, Schenectady, Troy area, with the largest sets having a 7-inch by 10-inch screen. With the war over, the very beginning of commercial television began. Although local advertising was almost nil because of small audiences, the station practically had to give the first commercials away. The only thing the sponsor was charged for was the cost of props. Then, on June 19, 1946, WRGB aired its first network commercial. Gillette was the sponsor, and the show was the heavyweight boxing championship between Joe Louis and Billy Conn. By 1948, there were nearly 2,000 television sets in the area, and that number thereby increased at a startling rate as the broadcast day lengthened and the number of programs grew. In the early 50s, WRGB televised programs from 4 television networks: NBC, ABC, CBS, and Dumont, as well as producing 28 local programs each week. Technical changes also improved in the mid-50s when WRGB's channel number changed from 4 to 6. Our transmission power was increased from 16 to 93 kilowatts. And a new transmission tower, 3 times as tall as the old, was put into operation. With a much larger coverage area, WRGB was now in position to provide services for years to come.
One of WRGB's most popular programs was the children's show Bread Time Stories, also known as the Freddie Freihofer Show. Let's relive a few moments from one of those early telecasts.
Now, who wants to squiggle? Who's this young lady up here? Hi. What is your name? Hi, Debbie. Where do you live? Come on, make a squiggle for me, Debbie. Doesn't Debbie look pretty there? What are you making? Debbie's making a big one. It looks like a horse. Did you make a horse for me? Look what Deb made. Deb made just the right shape for a horse, isn't it? Let's see, we put some ears on him up here. And don't forget his mane. See what Debbie did? A good-looking horse, isn't it? Thank you, Debbie. Will you hold that for me, hon? Now who's going to make a squiggle for me?
Hi.
Scott Flaherty. How old are you now, Scott?
5 years old.
You're 5, and where do you live?
I'm a small road in Glens
Up in
Falls.
Glens Falls. Did you start kindergarten this year? Isn't school lots of fun?
Yeah.
You going to squiggle for me today?
Yeah.
I'm glad you came down, Scott. Happy birthday. Get up there with the guy. Do the best you can. Send it to us. Put your mailing address on so we know where to send the button we have for you, and it's yours. By the way, you don't need to be a birthday kicker to join us in the crowd. Hi there. What is your name? What is your name? And where do you live, honey? Do you like to draw pictures?
WRGB has telecast thousands of local television programs over the past 60 years. How many of these shows do you recognize?
That was Pretty Tina Stout. And now, here are the Larry's Teens with Pagan Love Song.
In 1957, we moved to our current facility on Balltown Road in Schenectady. With full production news and programming services, the new studios greeted hundreds of area visitors each week, in effect becoming a local tourist attraction. In fact, during the open house, literally thousands of area residents passed through the new building, greeting celebrities of the day and learning how the marvel of television brought pictures to their home. Traffic jams went for miles around the station, despite the enormous parking facility next to the new building.
Over the next 30 years, the sophistication of programs and services would continue to keep pace with our audience's needs and desires, including our 1981 affiliation with the CBS television network. In 1983, General Electric sold WRGB to Unicom, owned by the New York City investment firm Forsman Little & Company. 2.5 years later, Freedom Newspapers Incorporated purchased WRGB, marking a new era in our development and the first ownership by a company solely in the communications business. Freedom's unequaled commitment to excellence and integrity reinforced the very foundations of WRGB's historic past as the longest continually operating television station in the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
As the first television station in the United States, WRGB was a pioneer in the truest sense of the word. We should pause to remember the genuine research and development effort that began in 1926 by the founders of WRGB. The countless experiments by Dr. E.F.W. Alexanderson helped set the standards for the entire country and laid the foundation for our industry. On January 13th, 1928, WRGB was born with the broadcast of an experimental television program. In March 1942, it received a commercial license, and we look forward to its 60th birthday in 1988. I can tell you from experience, some of one's most noteworthy accomplishments often happen after 60. Well, the founders of WRGB and its leadership over these many decades deserve our applause and our gratitude. The history of this station is truly the history of television.
Serving Albany, Schenectady, and Troy, our service area in New York and New England has grown to over 1 million television households in 5 Northeast states. Beginning in a small 12-foot studio in 1928, TV-6 is now housed in a 53,000 square foot communications complex, the largest television facility between New York City and Montreal. As the area's leading broadcaster, WRGB continues its pioneering growth today and looks forward to the future with renewed optimism and vigor. Yes, we're still making history. And like our beginnings, where the visions of tomorrow became reality, the challenges of future decades make us all pioneers with responsibilities to dream things and say, why not?
The first station, a WRGB history, was sponsored by your Albany area True Value hardware stores who salute WRGB and its 60 years of broadcasting. And by Blue Shield of Northeastern New York, your local healthcare team. And by the Charles Freihofer Baking Company, always as good as you remember.
And that concludes the program for today. We'll be on the air again tomorrow evening at 8:15. This is Ted Houston and WRGB wishing you all good night.
Years. There'll be even more events in the months ahead, including an open house with exhibits here at WRGB, and we'd like you to become part of that celebration. If you have memorabilia like photographs, videotapes, scripts, clippings, or even equipment that might be associated with WRGB, please let us know. We might like to borrow them and give you the credit at our open house. Just drop a line to our program manager, Terry Walden, and let him know what you'd like to share with us. Thanks for being with us.